There's going to be so many people that are going to be traveling these next few weeks. We want to keep them in our prayers. It's always kind of a testy time with the travel and the different traffic that's out there, so we want to keep them in our prayers. We'll have a lot of people that are gone. We have a lot of visitors that are in, probably for the next month, and so that's always a good thing. Always good to meet other people, visit with people that are members of other congregations. So if you're visiting with us this morning, we especially want to be thankful for your presence and let you know that you're an honored guest here. It's hard for me to believe that 2019 is almost over. I know we can probably say that every year, but it's always hard for me to believe that 2019 is almost over because, as the cliche goes, it feels like just yesterday when it was all starting. And if you think back, if you can put yourself in the shoes of you at the beginning of 2019, I would bet you that you probably never thought in a million years that this is what the end of 2019 would look like. There's so many different variables, there's so many different things, so many things have changed. And so it's hard to imagine at this time what the end of 2020 is going to look like. And so there's always kind of this element of change. But if you remember at the beginning of the year, we started off, as we have a yearly theme, we started off talking about, for this year, building strong homes. That was what we wanted to talk about throughout the course of this year. And so we touched on a variety of different subjects. We talked about the idea of singlehood. We talked about the nature of grandparents, how to raise children, which obviously, since I'm the one up here, I'm the foremost expert on that. We can't even get Levi to sleep longer than 3 hours at a time right now. But we talked about widows, and we talked about a lot of different aspects of what it means to have a family, whether you're a part of a big family, whether you're a part of a little family. And hopefully throughout the course of this year, you've taken the things that we've talked about here and in other places, you've taken those things and kind of put them in your own life. Taken a self-evaluation. Where do I stand? Where am I at on these different subjects? I know for myself, as I think back not only about the subjects we've talked about, but in the last 10 years that I've been here, it's hard to not see a lot of that growth in my own life. And I don't mean mental or physical growth, although the mental growth has probably been substandard. Physical growth has been pretty good in those 10 years. But the last 10 years when I moved here, I've changed quite a bit. 10 years ago I was single and I came here with my own ideas of what the work at Hillside would be like, and then I met Melina and I became a husband. I wasn't a single person anymore. Now I was in a different stage of life. Now I was a husband. And then we had Logan, Hannah, and Levi, and now I have kids and I'm a father. And so at some point, hopefully, prayerfully, I will be a grandfather. And so the things that we talked about during that lesson, hopefully I'll put into practice in my own life. But hopefully you've seen how these things kind of go through different stations and how we kind of move and progress throughout our life to the things we've talked about this year. Eventually, at some point, if the Lord allows this world to stand, I'll be able to say something similar to what David said. In 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 2, as he's sitting on his deathbed and he's talking to Solomon, he says in 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 2, I go the way of all the earth. And you see this phrase happening a lot in Scripture. It's not just unique to David, you see it happening all over the place. But what it in essence means is mankind has an expiration date. Mankind is not meant to live forever. Mankind is not meant to live eternally as on this earth. And so at some point, we will all go the way of all the people that have gone before us. But I think when you look at 1 Kings chapter 2 and what David says to Solomon in that section, I think it shows what type of person David was and how he approached the end of his life. In 1 Kings chapter 2, starting in verse 2, actually starting in verse 1, 1 Kings chapter 2, starting in verse 1, it says, as David's time to die drew near, he charged Solomon his son, saying, I'm going the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and show yourself a man. Notice how he gives some advice to David, or to Solomon. He says, keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, his testimonies, according to what is written in the law of Moses, that you may succeed in all that you do and wherever you turn. If only Solomon had kept to that advice. Verse 4, so that the Lord may carry out his promise which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons are careful in their way to walk before me in truth, with all their heart, with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. That's a fantastic set of instructions from father to son on how to move past or how to move forward in a world where you don't have your dad anymore. You don't have that mentor. You don't have that guiding force in your life. And so David gave him that set of circumstances. But David didn't just stop there. If you look in verse 5, he then talks about his own affairs. In verse 5, he says, now you also know what Joab, the son of Zeruiah, did to me. That's his right-hand man, his military commander, Joab. And you know what he did to the two commanders of the armies of Israel, to Abner, the son of Ur, and to Amasa, the son of Jether, whom he killed. He also shed the blood of war in peace. And he put the blood of war on his belt about his waist, and his sandals on his feet. So act according to your wisdom, Solomon. But don't let his gray hair go down to Sheol in peace. Then he brings up a second person. Show kindness, however, to the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite. Let them be among those who eat at your table. For they assisted me when I fled from Absalom your brother. You can read about that in 2 Samuel. Behold, verse 8, there is with you Shimei, the son of Gera the Benjamite of Bahurim. Now it was he who cursed me with a violent curse in the day I went to Mahanaim. But when he came down to me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. Now therefore, verse 9, do not let him go unpunished. For you are a wise man, and you will know what you ought to do to him, and you will bring his gray hair down to Sheol with blood. I think it's interesting that in these last few days or weeks or whatever this recorded incident is happening in this time span, I think it's interesting that at least in the last recorded conversation of David towards his son, he gives him a set of instructions. And then in verses 5 through 9, he says, look, at this person, treat him this way. This person, treat him this way. This person, treat him this way. And then as you read in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 10, it simply says that David died and went with his fathers. He slept with his fathers. He was buried in the city of David. And that's the end of his life. And so as you look at this last section, as you look at 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 9, verses 1 through 10, all of it got me thinking, when I'm on my deathbed someday, whenever that day comes, but whenever I'm on my deathbed, what will my legacy be like? What kind of instructions will I then give to Logan and Hannah and Levi? What instructions will I give to them and say, look, this is what you need to be doing in your life. Stay true to God. Focus on Him. What kind of instructions will I give to my children? And also, conversely, as you read here in verses 5 through 9, what instructions will I give them concerning people in my life? Deal gently with J. Stevenson, for he was also very evil to me in my life. Be kind to Levi, even though he really doesn't deserve it. What kind of instructions will I be giving to my kids about my life? What kind of instructions will I be giving to them? And it makes me think, what will my legacy be like? What will the remnants of my life, what will the memory of it be? And I think this idea is very similar, or is very commonly found in Scripture, not to be so depressing, but you find it, for instance, in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 2. Solomon says in one verse there, it is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, because that is the end of every man. And listen to this, and the living takes it to heart. Solomon isn't being depressing in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 2, and neither am I trying to be so depressing right now in talking about it. But what Solomon puts there in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 2 is, when we go to the house of mourning, we're faced with the reality that all of us will have at some point in our life. No matter how many times we try to shove it out the door, no matter how many times we try to sweep it under a rug, no matter how many times we try to ignore it, all of us are faced in that moment with the reality of our own mortality. And as he mentions there in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 2, the living, the smart, the wise, take it to heart. And so what I'm asking you this morning is to look at your own life. Think about whatever stage of life that you're in, and that's why we put this lesson at the end. Whatever stage of life you're in, whether you're younger, whether you're older, and I'm not going to try to put ages on that. No matter if you're single, no matter if you've got a family of 12, whatever stage you're at in this life, think about it real quick. What will your legacy be? And what instructions will you give to the next generation? What instructions will you give concerning people who will visit you at your deathbed? What type of people are you associating with in your life? What will your legacy be? What I wanted to do with this last lesson in the year, according to this theme that we're doing, what I wanted to do is give a few things that I want to be known for. These are totally personal to me, although I would probably wager that they're pretty common amongst a lot of us. So I tried to find, kind of toe that line between things that are personal to me, things that I think everybody can agree with. And you may add more to this. You may say, well, that's not really important to me. This is important to me. That's fine. But what I wanted to do is give you some things that I want my legacy to be, beginning, in my opinion, with the biggest and most important one. And that's the most important being in my life, is God. And I say that. Lena's not here. She's dealing with Levi. But that includes my family. That includes my friends. That includes the Red Sox. That includes anybody and everybody in my life. The most important being in my life is God. And I know a lot of people sometimes look at that, Matthew chapter 10, and they think to themselves, this is such a hard statement, such a hard thing to kind of put into practice. Because while we would all say, according to what he says there in Matthew chapter 10, while we would all say, I love God, I serve Him, He is my King, the reality is, sometimes we don't always do that. You see this type of love, for instance, in the martyrs. If you look into the martyrs' histories from the first few centuries, you have several instances where somebody is put to death in front of their family, and they're given a choice. You can denounce Christ and be with your family. You can be free right now. Or you can not denounce Him and you can die. And those martyrs, time after time after time, made the decision to give up their life in exchange for what they knew to be the truth, to defend the the honor and to defend the name of God. And I think, at least in part, this is exactly what Jesus is talking about. In Matthew chapter 10, look at verse 26. He says, don't fear them. I think he's talking very much about physical persecution. Therefore, don't fear them, for there is nothing concealed that won't be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. What I tell you in the darkness, speak in the light. What you hear whispered in your ear, proclaim upon the housetops. Don't fear those who can kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul. Rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Verse 29. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a cent? And yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father, but the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't fear, verse 31. You are more valuable than many sparrows. I love the understatement of verse 31. You're more valuable than many sparrows. Thanks. But the point is, if God even knows those little things, then he sees you. He builds on this in verse 32 by saying, therefore everyone who confesses me before men, I will also confess him before my Father who is in heaven. That is directly tied to the nature of persecution. And when persecution comes to your doorstep, are you going to deny him or are you going to confess him? And moreover, in my life, do I live in such a way that I confess him? Or do I live in such a way that denies him? Verse 33, whoever denies me before men, I will also deny him before my Father who is in heaven. And then it's almost as if Jesus takes this statement, this monologue here in chapter 10, he dials it up a notch. Because in verse 34 he says, don't think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came, verse 35, to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Verse 37, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who has found his life will lose it. He who has lost his life for my sake will find it. Sometimes I don't know if it's a subliminal thing or if it's something we do intentionally, but sometimes the way that we compartmentalize Matthew 10, 38, 39 is we say, unless we love God, or unless we love God more than the things of this earth, then we're not going to get into heaven. We tend to look at it in very terminal aspects. We're not going to get into heaven. And I think that aspect is absolutely there in Matthew chapter 10, but if you look at what he's talked about in the context, it is the idea of heaven. Entrance into heaven will not be available to you. But moreover, you won't live in such a way as to even attain heaven in the first place. If I lived in such a way where the most important thing to me in the world is my kids, and I love my kids, depending on the time of day, especially the hour of the night. I love my kids. But if I live in such a way that I treasure my kids above everything else, then guess what I'll start to sacrifice? I'll start to sacrifice personal Bible study time at the altar of soccer practices. Or I'll start to sacrifice praying with my children or praying towards God in my own personal private study or evangelism at the altar of my kids' band concerts. And I won't discipline them in the manner that I should be because the most important thing to me is whether or not they like me. The most important being in my life is God. It isn't just a fun, pithy statement. It's not as if it's just something that we try to put on the bumper sticker. It has implications for our life. And listen to me on this, ladies and gentlemen. Only by putting God first in our life can we truly love those around us as well. I want you to look at Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25. Look a few chapters in the future. Matthew chapter 25. A lot of people will say, I love God, I serve Him, He's my King. But the reality is our life doesn't manifest itself like that. Our life doesn't display that type of affection. And one of the ways we know it doesn't display that affection is because it's not manifest in our life around us to other people. Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 34, it says, the King will say to those on His right, come, you are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, you invited me in. Naked, and you clothed me. And I was sick, and you visited me. And I was in prison, and you came to me. Notice verse 37. Verse 37, the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry? When did we feed you? When did we see you thirsty, give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger? When did we invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick, or in prison, and come to you? Show of hands, you don't have to right now. Show of hands, how many people that saw Jesus sick, or how many people, if you saw Jesus destitute, hungry, how many people would feed him? See, 3 hands. That's kind of alarming. Every hand in this room should be up right now. It's kind of a rhetorical question. But every single one of us, if we saw Jesus destitute, we take care of him. But what you notice here in Matthew chapter 25, as Jesus says here in verse 40, the king will answer and say to them, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. What I want you to notice here is the passive nature by which these people served God. It wasn't as if they went out and saw Jesus begging on the side of the road and then gave him some money, gave him some food. That's not what happened. When Jesus says, you served me, he's putting himself as an extension of the service to other people. So that's why I say, ladies and gentlemen, we can only serve others, the ones that we love, by putting God first and foremost in our life. Because it's only through service to God, it's only through obedience and discipline and humility that we can truly serve those whom we love. And so Jesus' statement in Matthew chapter 10:26 isn't some random statement about how we need to hate our family. It's showing the true nature of sacrifice and showing the true nature of discipleship. Number 2, I hope that when I die, people say that I didn't let the short term distract me from the long term. We live in an age of smartphones, and I love smartphones, I love computers, I love technology, I love everything that it does for us in our life. But we all know the dangers associated with smartphones. We all know the dangers associated with social media, and you can almost tell physically if somebody is too into their phone because they kind of walk with a certain hunch. There's always this kind of slope back that comes from spending a lot of time on their phone, whether it's on the couch or whether it's walking. I get that sometimes. But we all know the dangers of short term. We all know the dangers of social media. But the question is, why do we still engage in that? You know as well as I do that there is nothing interesting on Facebook ever. You know as well as I do that YouTube only has so many videos. And so why is it that when we go on, okay, maybe they don't have so many videos, a billion uploaded every day. But then why do we get on Facebook on our phone or on our computer, and why do we just continually scroll? If I had a nickel for every time I saw somebody share grandma's best cobbler recipe, I'd be a millionaire by now. Why do we scroll? I think for some people it's a drug. I think for some of us it's just this kick that we just need to get where we look at somebody else's life, when we look at somebody else's life, when we look at somebody else's life. For some people it's a drug. We just need it. I think for other people, and I've been a part of this itself, I think for other people, it has to do with the idea of needing an escape from your life. I think for whatever reason your life possibly isn't going so well at that exact moment in time, or maybe there's a lot of chaos in your world, there's a lot of things happening in your immediate environment, and so we just need that little escape, and we find it by that little scroll, that scroll, and that scroll. Well, let me tell you, all the times that I've spent any amount of time on Facebook, and I love Facebook, but if I spend longer than 15, 20, 30 minutes a day on Facebook, and I look back at that time I'm usually not proud. And it's not because I did anything bad. It's just because I know I lost those 30 minutes. And it would shock you, or maybe it wouldn't shock you, to realize that the average amount of time an American spends on Facebook every day is 2 hours. 1/12 of every American's day is spent on Facebook. What could we do if we got those 2 hours back every day? What would society be like if we had those 2 hours? And more importantly, what would your life and my life be like if we had those 2 hours back? It's all about delaying gratification in order to get that long-term benefit. Look at Proverbs chapter 13. Proverbs chapter 13. When Solomon talks about this passage, I think it's something that's hard for us to do. We know the truth of it, but it's hard for us to do it sometimes. Proverbs chapter 13, starting in verse 9. Proverbs chapter 13, starting in verse 9. He says, the light of the righteous rejoices, but the lamp of the wicked goes out. Through insolence comes nothing but strife. But wisdom is with those who receive counsel. Wealth obtained by fraud dwindles, but the one who gathers by labor increases it. These all have to do with what we're going to get to. Look at verse 13. The one who despises the word will be in debt to it, but the one who fears the commandment will be rewarded. The teaching of the wise is a fountain of life, to turn aside from the snares of death. Verse 15. Good understanding produces favor, but the way of the treacherous is hard. Do you know what he talks about in those sections? When you read up through verse 15, when you read Proverbs chapter 13, 9 through 15, what he's getting at is avoiding sin, avoiding short-term pleasures, because there's something bigger at stake. I'm not going to give in to wickedness because holiness is more important to me. I'm not going to give in to these little microscopic things that bring me short-term gratification because I understand that I'm a child of God and I need to act like it. It's the essence of heaven. It's the essence of our Christian life in this world, where we delay things on this earth because we're looking for that city, Hebrews chapter 11, that has foundations. I love the way he ends this in verse 19. He says, desire realized is sweet to the soul, but it is an abomination to fools to turn away from evil. So many people will say with that, why would you not engage in this? Why would you not take this little bit of fun for yourself? After all, it's so much fun. Now, that's what he means in verse 19 when he says to turn away from evil is an abomination to fools. You see something very similar happening in John chapter 16. We'll take time to read it. But Jesus encourages his disciples to look for the long term. Don't give in to the short term. Don't give in to persecution. Don't give in to preserving your life now. Keep your eyes fixated on the prize. There's a story, I think in the 2nd century, of a man who was being persecuted by the Roman government. And he was put on this really, and I can't remember exactly what type of contraption it is, but this contraption that stretches your body out. Really painful. I think it's a wheel. They put him on a wheel and they stretched him out. And over and over and over again throughout the course of this torture session, he affirmed Christ, until the pain became so unbearable that he groaned, I deny my Lord, I deny Jesus. He fell off the wheel, he breathed once or twice, and then he died. And another Christian that was nearby looked at the situation and said, what wretched soul that you would exchange short-term pleasure for an eternity of pain. And that's the way it is in our life. We tend to think that sometimes the short-term happiness, the short-term pleasure is going to last forever. When in reality, we know that it's not. At some point, we're going to have to pay that check. At some point, we're going to be held responsible for what we do. And I pray that it's before we meet God, and it's everlastingly too late. Number 3, I hope that people tell me, or say about me that I did what I said I would. I want you to look at Colossians chapter 3 real quick. I hope people say about me, and this is probably the one that I'm the worst at, it's probably the one that I'm actively trying to improve the best, keeping true to your word, doing what you say. But in Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 5, he begins this section in verses 1 and 2 talking about rising to walk in newness of life, putting on Christ. Look what he says in verse 5. He says in Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, greed, which amounts to idolatry. There's a lot in that sentence by itself. Verse 6, for it is because of these things that the wrath of God will come upon the sons of disobedience, and in them you also once walked, when you were living in them. But now you also put them all aside, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth. And listen to verse 9. He isolates this in verse 9 and says, do not lie to one another, since you have laid aside the old self and its practices. I've always wondered as I look at Colossians chapter 3 and you read that list of sins, the list of immorality, the list of wickedness, why does he single out deception in verse 9? It's almost as if he gets through verses 5 to 8 and he hits all these different things, and then he says in verse 9, do not lie to one another. That's the most important thing Paul is driving at least in this context. Why is deception the worst thing that he could think about in that moment? The church of Colossae, like a lot of churches then and now, the church of Colossae was incredibly diverse. People come from different backgrounds. People come from all different social classes. But the one thing, ladies and gentlemen, that binds them is their common love for the truth. I don't know everything about every single member here. I know everything more than I need to know about Joe. But I don't know everything about every member here. But I know one thing that binds us all is our love and our devotion to truth. Our love and devotion to God's truth. Our love and devotion to objective religious truth. Now let me tell you right now, ladies and gentlemen, the second that we start deceiving each other, the second that we start being unfaithful, remotely untruthful to each other, the second that we start trying to manipulate situations, that's the moment when that trust and that relationship begins to break down. And I think that's why not only does he say this in verse 9, but he says in verse 10, put on the new self, who is being renewed to a true knowledge, according to the image of the one who created him, a renewal in which there is no distinction between Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian and Scythian, slave and freeman, but Christ is all in all. There's no distinction. I'm not trying to use the system. You're not trying to manipulate me. I'm just simply trustworthy. Let me ask you one question right now, ladies and gentlemen. If I can't trust you, or if you can't trust me, I'll make it about myself. I'll stop picking on Joe, even though it's oh so much fun. But if you can't trust me about what I say about the things of this world, if you can't trust me about where I was last week, if you can't trust me about something else entirely, something completely physical, then how can you trust what I have to say about the spiritual? If you can't trust my word anywhere else, then why should you listen to me when I talk to you about the gospel? And that applies not only to me, to you, and you to me, but it also applies to each other. If I go to my brother with sin that I know is evident in their life, they need to know that I'm trustworthy when I talk to them, that I'm not hearing it by gossip, I'm not creating it in my own mind, but I saw it and it needs to be fixed. And more importantly, I'm willing to help you through that. We need to be trustworthy to each other. You see that, for instance, in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. We go back to Ecclesiastes a couple of times today. Let's look at it one more time. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Starting in verse 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, starting in verse 1. Guard your steps as you go to the house of God. Draw near to listen rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools. For they don't know that they're doing evil. Don't be hasty in word or impulsive in thought to bring up a matter in the presence of God. For God is in heaven, you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. A dream comes through much effort, and the voice of a fool through many words. When you make a vow, verse 4, to God, do not be late in paying it, for he takes no delight in fools. Pay what you owe. It is better that you should not vow than you should vow and not pay. Do not let your speech cause you to sin, and do not say in the presence of the messenger of God that it was a mistake. For why should God be angry on account of your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For in many dreams and in many words there is emptiness. Rather, fear God. There's a value in the things we say to each other. We talked about this last week in regards to gossip, but there's a value in what we say to each other. But not only is there a value in what we say to each other, but there's a value in what we say to God. Because if I'm untrustworthy with you, if I lie to you, if I manipulate you, then what's to say that I won't try to do the same thing with God? Now we know intellectually that none of us can deceive God. But what's to say that we won't get to Judgment Day and look at God and say, well, I know that you said this, but what about that? If we can't even be honest and faithful amongst each other, what does that say about our relationship to God? So doing what you say you do doesn't just apply to interpersonal relationships, it also applies very strongly to obedience. Next, I hope that people look at me. They say this is a guy that strove for excellence. And not just in the obvious things of life, not just in the things that we can see, but in every aspect of our life. I pray that I am somebody that strove for excellence. I think it's interesting when you look at 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 5, he talks about all these different stair-step of growth, stair-step of spiritual growth. He says, add to your faith virtue, add to your virtue knowledge. But you notice real carefully in 2 Peter chapter 1, he doesn't say, add to your faith, I can't remember exactly what it said before that, but add to your faith morality. He says, add to it moral excellence. It's not enough, ladies and gentlemen, for us to just be adequate. It's not enough for us just to be okay Christians. Where we're here Sunday, Wednesday, and we may read our Bible, we may not. We may obey God, we may not. It's not enough for us to be okay Christians. And there are a lot of people in this world, and I've been this type of person, where I just show up sometimes, and I don't really care that I'm here. It's not this morning, in case you're wondering, but I don't really care that I'm here. I read the Bible, I don't really pay attention. It's not enough for that. And it's not enough to just be an okay husband. It's not enough to just be an okay father. It needs to be a continual growth in our lives, where we're always striving towards excellence. If you look at Matthew chapter 5, we won't take the time to read it, but if you look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 48, Jesus ends this first third of his Sermon on the Mount by talking about forgiveness. And he says there in verses 43 through 48, if you only forgive those who have forgiven you, what good is that? The Gentiles do the same. I want to be somebody who forgives other people, even if they don't deserve it, even if they didn't ask for it. I want to be somebody who forgives others. That to me is the most important thing. Speaking about forgiveness, I hope that someday, when I'm on my deathbed or on my tombstone or whatever it is, that people say, I forgave as I was forgiven. I don't think there's many things harder in this life than realizing that there's loose ends in your life, that there's people that you've affected, there's people that you've impacted in a negative way, and you don't talk to them anymore. There have been people in my own life that I've hurt, there's been people in my life that have hurt me, and for whatever reason our paths have kind of diverged over the span of time. And it's very easy for us to get into this feeling of, well, maybe I'll get to it, I'll talk to them when I can, or maybe when it's convenient. This is one of the good things of social media, by the way, the fact that we can connect with these people. But we think to ourselves, well, I'll get around to forgiving them. I'll get around to it when it's convenient for me. And then days turn into weeks, turn into months, turn into years. And we stand before God expecting grace. And he asks me, where was yours? Where was yours, Brady, in regards to this incident? Where was your mercy in regards to this? Not many of us know anything about President Garfield. President, I think, 1880, 1884. He's not really one of those more well-known presidents. He kind of fits in the shadow of Lincoln. But what we know about President Garfield was that he was actually a member of the church. He's famous for saying, he was actually an elder in the church, he was famous for saying when he was elected president, I'm now leaving the highest office in the land to become president of the United States. I think that says a lot about where he's at spiritually. But President Garfield was walking along the road one day, I think he was in a train station, and he was assassinated by some guy. He was assassinated by a guy who was deranged, who was upset with him for a very personal / non-personal reason. And in that day and age, they didn't have the medical understanding that we do, where sometimes it's better to just leave the bullet in there. And so what doctors did for the span of 4 months was they kept getting their germy hands, this was before they understood germs, they took their germy hands and they probed inside President Garfield every day, every week, every month. For 4 months they did this. Now President Garfield probably would have died anyways. But what that probing did, time after time, putting in forceps, putting in their germy fingers, what it did was it transformed his death into a very painful, excruciating end to his life. That's the way it is with us. In regards to people in our life, we know that there's people that I've impacted, there's people that I've hurt, and until I deal with it, until I gain their forgiveness, I just keep revisiting it. And I keep saying, well, someday I'll get around to it, and then I'm reminded of how I haven't forgiven them. I'm reminded of that thing that I don't do. And over time, it starts to affect me. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to deal with the people that are in our life. The people that we've been harsh to, the people that we've been mean to, the people that we've sinned against. Because how we deal with our relationship with them, according to 1 John chapter 4, reflects on how we deal with our forgiveness with God. John chapter 8 is probably the most cliche section to look at this, but I want you to read it. John chapter 8, starting in verse 1. The more I revisit this scene, and this is always the scene that I think about in regards to my own life. Because I can picture myself as this adulterous woman. Time and time again, not to the specific sin, but obviously to the position that she finds herself in. But in John chapter 8, starting in verse 1, or verse 2 rather, it says, early in the morning he came again to the temple, and all the people were coming to him. He sat down and began to teach them. And the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, and having set her in the center of the court, they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act. There's no question what's going on. Verse 5, now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say? In verse 6, they were saying this, testing him, so they might have grounds for accusing him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. By the way, anybody else ever wonder what Jesus wrote about there? What did Jesus draw? I would love to know what it was that he put there. Verse 7, but when they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said to them, he who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. Less than 20 words. And he diffused a situation that almost cost somebody her life. Now what Jesus never did in this scenario, what Jesus never did, was excuse what she did. As a matter of fact, you can see it in the verses that follow, where he says to her, go and sin no more. He is acknowledging that sin was present. But what he did was not so much for the woman. What he did was for the benefit of the people. What he asked everyone to do in that great moment was to take a look inside their own soul and ask themselves if they're not guilty of something else. And only in realizing their own sinfulness, the fact that they've done wrong things in their life, could they then extend the mercy that they so desperately want to this other person. And that's the realization that we all need to come to. Sometimes we hold on to grudges for years with somebody else. We hold on to grudges and we sit there and we stare at them across the auditorium. We say, I can't believe that guy had the gall to show up this morning, knowing what sin is present in their life. And then we realize that if the tables were turned, we wouldn't want to answer that question either. We wouldn't want to answer for our own sins. We wouldn't answer for our own souls without mercy and grace being present. There's a reason that Jesus says, as you forgive others, so will be forgiven to you. If I can't forgive other people, what right do I have for grace and mercy? I hope that someday when I'm on my deathbed or after I'm long gone, that people will say, I was forgiven, or I forgave, as I know that I was forgiven. There's a poem that I keep coming back to. It's not like John 8 in this regard, but there's a poem I keep coming back to, and I think it perfectly fits not only with this lesson, but also with this theme for this year. And you probably can recite it by memory as I'm saying it to you. A poem called The Dash. Anybody ever heard that poem? This is going to be good for you then, Joe. It says, I read of a man who stood to speak at the funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on the tombstone from the beginning and to the end. He noted that first came the date of birth and spoke the following date with tears. But he said what mattered most of all was that dash between those years. For that dash represents all the time they spent alive on earth, and now only those who love them know what that little line is worth. For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash. What matters is how we love or live in love, and how we spend our dash. So think about this long and hard. Are there things you'd like to change? For you never know how much time is left that can still be rearranged. To be less quick to anger and show appreciation more, and love the people in our lives like we've never loved before. If we treat each other with respect and more often wear a smile, remembering that the special dash might only last a while. So when your eulogy is being read with your life's actions to rehash, would you be proud of the things they said about how you lived your dash? It's an incredibly gripping poem. I can get copies if you would like. I think that's an incredibly gripping poem. And it encapsulates not only what we're talking about this morning, but what we've talked about all this entire year. Am I striving to be a better family member? Am I striving to be a better husband, a better father, a better church member? Am I striving to be a better Christian devoted to God? And if you haven't even started on your journey, I'm here to tell you your dash begins with baptism. Your dash begins with repentance. It begins with confession. It begins with believing and hearing the Word of God. It begins with beginning that walk towards God. And if you're here this morning, you need to get that right with God. I would encourage you to do it now, because we have no idea what tomorrow will bring. Do it now as we stand in that.